Nicene Creed, begotten, not made. The main culprit of the origin and propagation of heresy is the fact that Christ was seen only through the lens of the law, as opposed to being the manifestation of the promise. However, when one pays careful attention, one finds that heretical assertions are corrected by the early church fathers using the same approach. Namely, they offered a correction in the law as opposed to an emphasis on the promise. In other words, their answer to heresy frequently came in the form of an argument based in logic that was simply a corrective in the law. Therefore, the issue was not necessarily resolved. Let's review for a moment. In an earlier episode on the Apostles' Creed, we talked about a conflict in the early church identified as Gnosticism. Gnosticism, in a variety of forms, attempted to spiritualize salvation as an escape from the earthly, physical nature with its attendant limitations. The early church fathers countered these heretical ideas by placing a strong emphasis on the bond between creation and redemption. Their argument was fairly straightforward. The one who redeems must be the same God as the one in and through whom all things were made. Let's turn to the specific topic of this episode, the language of the Nicene Creed that confesses Jesus as begotten and not made. What is at stake theologically and thus pastorally in these words? The main culprit of the origin and propagation of heresy is the fact that Christ is seen only through the lens of the law, as opposed to being the manifestation of the promise. For starters, recognize this concept did not appear out of thin air, but is rooted in Scripture. The Gospels are univocal in identifying Jesus as the Son of God. Maybe you've heard it in one of the most quoted verses in the Bible, John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. Moreover, the Gospels record Jesus saying as much, speaking of himself as the Son of God, who is one with the Father. As stated in the 4th chapter of Galatians, Paul also understood Jesus to be the Son of the Father. Now, you would think that the issue is straightforward and indisputable. But as we're going to see, debates still arose. Why did they arise? As mentioned before, arguments arise when people start analyzing and thinking about the person and work of Christ from the perspective of the law, as opposed to simply hearing him as the promised word. On its face, it must be noted that the language of the Scriptures distinguishes between the Father and the Son. At the same time, the Scriptures clearly declare that God is one. Naturally, what happens at this point is that people start thinking about these issues in terms of logical propositions. That is to say, in the eyes of the law. So they start asking logical questions and analyzing how it can be that there's a distinction between the Father and the Son while still maintaining that there is one God. It was in trying to explain this distinction that problems arose. The early church father Tertullian tried to use a set of metaphors as a way out of the problem. He used several metaphors, including the image of a tree with roots and the image of rays of light emitting from the sun. He used these images of one thing with two different forms, to help explain how it is there is a Father and a Son and yet one God. Another very influential teacher and early church father named Origen picked up on these analogies and tried to further explain the relationship between the Father and the Son as united in one God. Origen's proposal was that in Jesus the human and divine nature began to be woven together, so that by fellowship with the divinity, the human nature might become divine. As mentioned before, arguments arise when people start analyzing and thinking about the person and work of Christ from the perspective of the law, as opposed to simply hearing him as the promised word. Rather than that of a tree or the sun with rays of light, Origen used the image of a piece of metal in the fire. Origen invited people to imagine the Logos as the fire. Then imagine Christ's human soul as the metal placed in the fire. Eventually, Origen argued the one becomes totally converted to the other. So, the Son, which was placed in the Logos and wisdom of God, eventually is in all that he does, all that he feels, and all that he understands. The term Origen employed to describe this combination of two natures is homoousia. We'll discuss this term in a future episode. But what was important to these early church fathers was an emphasis that the Logos was subordinate to the Father. They are both eternal from the beginning, but there is a hierarchy between the two, with the Father placed higher than the Son in that hierarchy. The difficulties with both Tertullian's and Origen's understanding of the Son as subordinate to the Father became clear in the views of a popular preacher named Arius. Arius cleaned up the logic used by Tertullian and promoted by Origen by stating the obvious. Someone subordinate could not be eternal. Therefore, Arius preached that only God the Father is eternal and unoriginated. The Logos, the Christ before the Incarnation, was a creature that had a beginning. To promote his understanding, Arius came up with a slogan that he shared amongst his congregations. The slogan said something like this: "There was a time when the Son was not." For Arius, Jesus was a demigod, neither fully divine nor fully human. He was inferior to the Father, lower in the hierarchy. Jesus became divine in the same way saints are made divine, by participating in the work and nature of the Father. This eventually led Arius into trouble, as he claimed the Son was not from eternity. In essence, said Arius, Jesus was not fully divine and thus did not have the same power as the Father for salvation. So let's turn back to the language of the Nicene Creed that addresses this controversy. Begotten, not made. What was at issue with this language is whether or not Jesus is eternal. To talk about this, let's split the phrase into two parts and begin by explaining the importance of the word begotten. Humans are begotten. They are not made out of nothing. Put a man and a woman together and they beget a child. Now, how does that relate to Jesus? As John says, the Logos became flesh. It was in the beginning, and so the Virgin bore the Son of God, who is Emmanuel, God with us. The Logos, that is to say, the Word, became incarnate flesh. Now let's look at the second part of the phrase, not made. Think about it in terms of the creation story in Genesis. Light is made by God. Heaven and earth are made by God. To be made by God out of nothing is to be created and not the creator. That means these things did not exist before God made them. Therefore, they are not eternal. Now apply that to Jesus. If Jesus were something the Father made, then he would not be eternal. If he is not eternal, then he does not have the same being and power of the Father. Logically, that would mean Jesus is not fully divine and thus not fully God. So the opponents of Arius and the authors of the Nicene Creed made it clear that Jesus was not created, but begotten. A created thing does not share the same substance of the Creator. Jesus was begotten of the Father, which is where he gets his divinity. Simply put, Jesus shared the same substance, power, and authority of the Father. His word had the same effect as the Father's word to create and to make new. To say otherwise would call into question Christ's ability and authority to forgive sins, and on the last day to raise the dead. Now, to be sure, what was just laid out is setting forth the logical corrective to Arius's heresy. And this sort of argument was at the heart of the language established in the Nicene Creed. But it isn't the logic of the argument that matters. The words of the Nicene formula are simply restating what Scripture says. Problems began when viewing Christ's nature and salvation in relationship to the law, and not apart from the law in a radical word of promise. As you'll hear in the next lecture, Tertullian, Origen, and Arius were not alone in their struggles to understand and articulate the person and nature of Christ. Simply put, they weren't the only ones who struggled to put these concepts together in the lens of the law.
Sorry, not for me. I'm out.
I didn't understand what you said, and for that reason, I'm out.
And so we see time and again that the relationship between the humanity and the divinity of Jesus created disputes that further inform what we teach and preach about Christ today.